Nice. Remind me of your guys' names.
Neil.
Neil?
Ava.
Ava. Neil and Eva. Okay, we'll give it a couple more minutes and see if people show up. I'm excited. I'm excited too. I've been looking forward to this one.
Yeah, I told her, I was like, man, it's probably one thing I think our weakest at is this. So we can both learn.
Yeah. So cool. Cool. You guys been working on any writing projects in the meantime?
Yes.
Yeah, so she started doing a while more with like fan fiction stuff, and then a couple of her friends are also doing it, so it's nice.
Internet.
It's also nice because
Well, I'm gonna just.
since she's not by herself with it,
Yeah.
you know, writing, it's a very small, very young writing group with her.
Hey, that's great. That is super awesome. Like, I didn't have anything like that growing up. Like, I mean, the closest I had was when I was in high school. I was doing storytelling at Hanford High. And so I was working with other students who were doing that, but like, we never worked on projects together. And there was kind of this weird attitude of very high competition with one another instead of collaboration, and that just kind of stunk.
It's probably like, I mean, if you want to talk about like, it's weird that, you know, your kid getting out of high school has almost no financial literacy, or if you want to talk about certain aspects. But what I always think is the weirdest is, you know, I did high school, and I got my bachelor's, I got my master's.
On page 34.
Even through my master's, I'm like, why are group so bad? Like, why are group projects so, how are we not doing better at teaching people that working together is beneficial?
Yeah.
It's just you've done these specific constraints that make it awful. I had to kick someone out of my thesis project down our final semester, because the semester before she plagiarized.
No way.
And I was like, here's my deal.
How that was? I mean, plagiarism's bad in general, but
Oh,
how,
it was blatant. Like, it was bad.
like whole paragraphs of text.
Oh, yeah. Non-cited, just copy paste, move on. And I was like, look, here's my thing. I would prefer just knowing that I have to do more work up front.
Yeah.
And at the 11th hour, figure out how to navigate that.
Oh yeah.
And be like, oh, that's all plagiarized for.
My bachelor's degree, my focus was, that's where I did my creative writing stuff.
Oh, nice.
And my capstone was like all the other people that I was graduating with, they were all doing like short stories and poems because that was kind of the norm. And I went a completely different route. I did comic literature. That had always been my focus. And so I did a series of comic strips.
Okay.
And so like I hired an artist. She was gonna work on some really cool stuff for me. She had some great designs. And then like the entire, thank you, Tanya. The entire time, like the semester before I was supposed to graduate, she did one doodle the entire time. And she's like, I'm still working on character designs. And I'm like, I gave you this stuff like 5 months ago. What have you been doing? She's like, oh, I'm racing my Subaru. You're fired.
Yeah, we gotta move on. We got stuff to be done.
Yep. All right, so let's jump in here. I do have my live stream going, which is nobody has joined us, so that's a bummer. That's okay though. It'll go out on YouTube and people can watch it again later and get more upfront with it. Kind of talking about what we're doing today. So I'm gonna kind of shorthand my introduction, but we're gonna be talking about what action is, why it needs to matter. Yeah, if you guys want to move up, you're more than welcome to. Mutually influencing, pacing, embrace all senses, and then we'll have some tips on how to write. And then there is it says prompy, but it's supposed to be prompt. That's a typo. I don't know what happened there.
It sounds more fun that way.
I know, it's writing prompy.
Yeah.
So obviously, for those of you who have never watched anything on my YouTube channel, and just to kind of remind you who I am, I'm Garrett K. Jones. These are my bona fides, 5 books in my series right there, if anyone's interested. I do a couple podcasts. War of the Stars is the big one that I do. It's a Star Wars podcast, and then Storytellers, which is kind of on hiatus at the moment. I just finished my 6th season of The Right Way on YouTube just a couple weeks ago. So cool. One of my favorite genres to read is science fiction. There's a lot of action in that, sometimes not so much. And I actually just got done reading through a trilogy of books by A.G. Riddle called the Long Winter Trilogy. Really good. It's actually fairly clean. So you can probably read, with kids involved. Anyway, so we want to talk about what action is. So action could be a chase, either on foot or by car. It could be an accident or an injury. Usually the more slapstick or intense, the more action is usually going to be put in place. It could be an explosion. It could be a natural disaster. It could be a sporting event. Or it could be a battle or a fight. That's typically what people think about when they think of action, is they think characters getting involved and fighting. But these are typically some of the types of stuff that you will see. And sometimes action can be used in a serious, most of the time it's used seriously. Other times it can be used in a more comedic sense. Think Roadrunner and Coyote. There's tons of action in those cartoons. Usually it results in something very, very dangerous and serious happening to the coyote, and yet he still manages to survive every single time. Usually a lot of accidents and injuries, explosions, and chases are involved with those episodes. And they're some of my favorite. I grew up on those. But so types of fights. When we're thinking about fights, because that's typically what people think of when it's action, we think of, there's hand-to-hand combat. There's the use of weapons, whether it's guns, swords, bombs. You could have a sci-fi fight. This is where you have specifically sci-fi technology being involved. You could also flip-flop it as fantasy as well, or even horror, depending on what subgenre that you're looking at doing. And then you could have an active type of fight where it's on the move. So for example, if you have, one of my favorite video games growing up was Mortal Kombat. While it's a fighting game, it's hand-to-hand with some weapons involved. There's kind of a fantasy element to it, but for the most part it's static, meaning that everything happens in that space on the screen. Nothing's moving. While the characters are moving around each other, for the most part, they're not changing locations. Whereas if you get a really good chase sequence, like one of my favorite chase sequences is from John Wick Chapter 4, where he's being chased all across Manhattan, and it goes from him being on a motorcycle to being on a horse, what have you. It works very well, and the action is setting up everything around that chase. So it's action on the move. Hi, welcome.
Hello.
What's your name?
Amy.
Amy?
Yes.
Welcome, Amy. Glad to have you.
Nice to meet you.
You kind of missed a little bit of it, but if you'd like, I can provide you with the link to catch up to the beginning when it gets posted to YouTube.
Oh, okay, yes. If you could give me that information.
Yeah. Not a problem. In fact, I believe there will be a link at the end so that you guys can link up with my YouTube channel.
Okay, cool.
All right, so these are the types of fights that you might encounter, and I'm sure there are others that I've missed. But the thing about action is that it needs to matter. Action has as much of a place as any other scene in your story. So it doesn't matter what genre you're writing, whether it's crime, whether it's suspense, whether it's horror, whether it's fantasy, whether it's sci-fi, whether it's romance, whether it's comedy. Action has as much of a place as any other scene. It should avoid feeling like filler. A lot of the times you have, I think cinematically, I think of movies a lot of the time, and you have these action set pieces that they happen because the script says that they need to happen, but there's really no rhyme or reason. I think a great example of this would be The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. A lot of the action that takes place in the second act of that movie happens simply because the script needs it to happen, not because it actually makes sense for what's going on. It looks like a cool action set piece, but when you go back and you rethink it, it feels like a filler to the story. It doesn't really move the plot. So it should, and the question you should ask yourself is, would the story progress if you delete the scene? Okay? So if you were to get rid of that action scene, does the rest of the story progress the way it needs to progress? Because like you look at a film director like Michael Bay, there's a lot of action for the sake of action. He's very bombastic in the way that he does that kind of stuff, and he does it very well. Don't get me wrong, but it can be a little frustrating when, if you were to remove that fight or that chase sequence or whatever it is, it has no bearing on the actual plot. Sometimes it does, and it does well, but other times not so much. So here's some additional questions that you need to ask yourself. First, why is this scene happening? Okay? What prompts the scene to happen? What's the cause of it? Usually action is caused because of conflict, and conflict can be due to person upon person, person against the world, person against society, person against nature. Whatever that conflict is, that's going to be your root stem for why the scene is taking place. All right? Now think Castaway. There's a scene in the film where he is trying to get off the island with a raft that he has made. It doesn't work well, and the scene is it's not like fast-paced action. It's very methodical in the way it's done. But as Tom Hanks is trying to get off the island, he can't get over this cresting wave because he doesn't have the right type of raft or the right type of boat, and it flips him over. It shatters the boat. All the rope that he has made is gone, and he ends up getting dragged along a coral reef and cutting his leg open. And so this whole thing stems because he has made a raft to get off the island, and his whole goal is to escape. All right. So then you need to think about who is involved and what led to the action. So which characters are involved? Why are they doing the things? Because action happens because characters make a choice. All right, and you want your characters to feel like they have agency within the scope of the story. We talked about this a couple months ago when we were talking about writing dynamic characters, and your characters should feel like they're real people that make choices and decisions based upon whatever they're confronting. And if they're confronting something that leads to a particular action, maybe it's getting into a fight, maybe it is dancing with someone that they really like, or maybe it's a sporting event that they're going to. Whatever that action is, you need to know who's involved and what led to it, the choices that were made. Other questions. The next question is, what are the potential outcomes for both sides? And this is where you want to look at consequences. Consequences can be good, they can be bad, they can be neutral. All right? You need to look at all the outcomes for everybody involved. Okay? Case in point, how many of you have seen Empire Strikes Back? Raise your hands. Okay. Spoiler alert, I'm going to probably be ruining the ending for you, Amy.
Oh no, not that.
But there's a fight at the end between Darth Vader and Luke Skywalker, and in the end, Darth Vader cuts off Luke Skywalker's hand and reveals this long-kept secret. And it completely changes the dynamic of how they interact with one another. Like, Luke was there, he was ready to fight and kill Vader because he thought Vader's just this evil guy that I've got to destroy. Vader killed my mentor, Obi-Wan Kenobi. I've got to get back at him. And when he learns who Vader is in his connection, it changes the entire dynamic for how he thinks about Vader, how he wants to interact with Vader. He's terrified of Vader because he went into this fight thinking, I'm pretty awesome at what I'm doing. I've been learning some stuff. And come to find out, he doesn't know nearly as much as he needs to. He is not ready for this fight. and he gets wounded in the worst way. He's wounded emotionally, he's wounded physically, and he almost loses his life in the process. And what's more, the goal that he was trying to accomplish, which was rescuing his friends, is only partially completed because Han Solo gets frozen into a block of carbonite. For Vader, the outcome is he is finally reunited with someone from his past. And he doesn't want to kill Luke, but if he has to, he will, because that's the kind of driven character that he is. And so now it's creating conflict for Vader as far as who he is loyal to. Is he going to be loyal to his Emperor, whom he has served for the better part of his life, or is he going to switch loyalties back to Luke, who is related to him? The next question that you want to ask yourself is, how will the fallout impact your characters in the story? This is continuing on with those consequences. All right? What is that fallout? What does it look like? How are the characters going to interact with other characters after this event? Are they going to have trauma? Are they going to be distant? Are they going to be angry? How are they going to respond to the situations that they find themselves moving forward? And then, so this is where we want to talk about things being mutually influencing. Action scenes should influence your characters as much as the rest of the plot. Okay? So again, this goes back to choices. Was it their choice? Was it the character's choice? And does it impact their character arc? What's going to happen with them? I have a character in my first book. His name is Asher. And Asher is half celestial. So he's half human, roughly half angel. And he, in about a third of the way through the book, gets bitten by a vampire. What happens when you have a character like that who gets bitten? And it's a brief, quick scene of action. He's trying to break out of the vampire stronghold in these caves. In the process, he gets bit. And the next thing he knows, he blacks out. It wasn't his choice to get bit. It was his choice to try and escape. It goes badly. The impact on his character arc is that now he's infected. What's going to happen next? I have another character in book one. His name is Gavin. Gavin is given a choice. He is visiting an elder dragon. This elder dragon says, you have two choices. You can either start your training with me and do what you need to do, or you can go and save this woman that you love from certain death. What will it be? He chooses the latter. And in the process, it leaves him vulnerable later on in the book in a way that he cannot account for. Which then ends up setting up the events of book 2 and how he has to learn from that mistake. All right. Action scenes, especially fights, give you the chance to portray character aspects and dynamics that often get overlooked in other set pieces. It gives you, this is where you get to give your characters agency. Okay? How are they going to fight? So I've been participating in the last few days in a story writing competition with Writer's Playground. And the story that I'm writing is about this character who, as a small child, encountered a goblin that attacked him and tried to capture him. And at the end of the story takes place when he's an adult, and he goes and he hunts down that goblin and finds him. And they get into another fight, and the fights kind of look very similar in that in the first time the goblin tackles him. He's a small child. He's trying to kick the goblin off of him, and it fails miserably. This time, the goblin tries to tackle him, and he's bigger, he's stronger, he's actually able to kick the goblin off of him, and the goblin goes down a tunnel, he follows the goblin down, and he ends up tackling and pinning the goblin and destroying the goblin. So you can play off of how the characters interact during these kinds of scenes, what choices that they make, and how they defend themselves, whether they throw the first punch or not, whether they try to avoid the fight or not. It's all up to the characters to make that decision based on their personalities, based on the way that you've written them. But it allows you to show these dynamics of how they choose to interact with these action scenes. All right, think about characters that are non-violent. They're pacifists. Okay, what happens when they're put into a situation where they have no other choice? Are they going to continue to remain non-violent and non-combatant and let themselves get hurt? Or are they going to avoid the fight while still being in the midst of the action? Or are they going to actually break their rule and fight? All right. A great example of this, there was a movie called Hacksaw Ridge with Andrew Garfield. And the character that Garfield plays is he wants to go into war, he wants to be a field medic, but he doesn't want to carry a gun, he doesn't want to be a combatant, he doesn't want to get involved in a fight because he is a conscientious objector, but he still wants to serve his country. They try to prevent him from being a part of the military, and they find that it is his right to be a conscientious objector and still be in the midst of war. And you see him running through the battlefield, avoiding the skirmish wherever he is, and trying to help wounded people, even though he has nothing to defend himself with. So we want to talk about pacing. All right? These are some factors that you need to keep in mind when developing the pacing of your action scenes. The first factor that you want to look at is genre. What do action scenes look like in your genre? So Amy, what do you like to write?
Well, I have not written anything specific recently, but I guess it would be a romance for me.
Okay. All right, so what do most action scenes look like in a romance story?
Basically, where there's a couple and they meet in a romantic setting. Doesn't have to be a public setting, but from there, maybe like a walk on the beach, something like that, and then yeah.
Okay, so
Maybe
usually,
hobbies or something.
yeah, so maybe they go and they do some kind of joined hobby, or usually this is kind of like a date situation. Would that be accurate to say?
Basically, yeah.
Okay, so in that regard, so most of your action scenes are going to be those date events, like maybe they go ice skating, or maybe they go for a walk in the park or on the beach, or maybe they go dancing, or they're interacting with other friends or people like that.
Yeah.
Whereas there are other aspects too, especially when you get to more adult romance, that those action scenes are a little bit different action and would be described differently, and those would actually play more in like romance scenes than anything else. But yeah, that would be a particular type. Whereas you have, if you look at science fiction, because usually like romance would be paced fairly evenly. There might be a little bit of things sped up just for the sake of time, and usually it would be more like, if anything serious happens, it would be more for like a comedic beat. Not always, but that can be the case. Whereas like if you do with something with science,
A romance comedy.
right, like a romantic comedy. As with sci-fi, you would have things that are a little bit more protracted, things that are drawn out. You might have a brief moment of action, followed by something that's a little bit more paced out and drawn out. where the action becomes a little bit more methodical. You see this a lot with space battles. Sometimes the space battles can be really, really fast. Sometimes they can be slow, and it just depends on what kind of tone you're trying to convey with that genre. One thing that I do recommend is that if you're going to write a scene, especially take a look at how action scenes are written in that genre. So look for examples and then see how they're paced. Do they happen quickly? Do they happen slowly? Or do they happen at some pace in between? The next thing you need to look at, the next factor, is your audience. Are your readers into heavy action, or are they into something lighthearted? All right, and this is about knowing your audience more than anything else. While I'm a big fan of writing the story that you would like to read as the writer, know your audience. All right, if, for example, you're writing an action scene that is going to be geared more towards younger readers, like 13, 14, 15, there shouldn't be a whole lot of graphic detail as far as how gruesome and how bloody and how violent a fight scene gets. There should not be any graphic content. Whereas if you're writing something that is more geared towards mature adults, having those themes being in there would be fine. But again, if your audience is used to you writing something that's in a different genre, pay attention to that, because that might turn readers off. Although they could be very well surprised, and they may not like that change of tone. You also want to pay attention to writing style. Does your personal writing style lend itself to lots of action? Mine does. I love writing action scenes. I grew up doing martial arts, so I love writing the hand-to-hand stuff, because that's kind of how my brain thinks. The big bombastic sequences, they're great. I'm not as strong at writing them, and so I try to keep that brief so I can focus on individual characters. That way you can understand that they're in the midst of the action, but the focus is more on them and what they are individually dealing with. But if you're writing something else, pay attention to what your writing style is. If you don't enjoy writing heavy action scenes, don't worry about it. If you do, great. All the more power to you. But just pay attention to how your writing style fits in with what you're trying to write. The next factor to pay attention to is your current scene. Some scenes can last a few sentences, some for a few pages. All right? If you have an action scene that goes on for 10 pages, that's a lot of action. That's a lot of descriptions, that's a lot of movement. Okay? That can be very, very exhausting for a reader. All right? So think about a movie that you've seen recently that may have had a lot of action. How did you feel afterwards?
Like maybe out of breath or something.
Out of breath?
Yeah, the stunt scenes or something.
Okay. What else? Ava, what about you? What's a movie that you've seen that, or a TV show maybe, that has a lot of action to it? How'd you feel after the action was over? The Last Airbender or the Blue People?
Yeah, that's it.
Oh, the good one. Okay.
Towards the valley of action.
Okay. Like, was there a particular scene that stood out to you that left you with kind of an emotional response? Okay. Okay. Neil, what about you? Okay. Neil, what about you?
I did watch Deadpool and Wolverine, so there's a lot of
Yes.
action there.
Yeah.
As I said, it's that kind of that frenetic pace, so you're a little on, you might be a little bit on edge depending on like how much is actually resolved.
Yeah.
It's usually where I'm at. Or that sense of like, oh, okay. So I think it kind of depends on like what's left at the end of that action.
Yeah. So last year when I went to go see John Wick Chapter 4 in theaters, there's a scene towards the end where he's trying to climb this flight of stairs in Paris, and it's hundreds of feet up, up this incline of stairs, and every time he's going up, there's a new group of bad guys out trying to kill him and trying to stop him from achieving his goal. And he's knocked down at least twice, all the way back down to the very bottom of the staircase. And he still keeps getting up. I'm like, there's a part of me where I'm holding my breath, I gasp, and I'm like, are you kidding me? This is still going on 5 minutes later. So take a look at how long your scene is lasting, because you don't want to overwhelm your audience with how long that action sequence takes. You want to give them some kind of break so that they can kind of emotionally reset before the next scene takes place. All right. One of the things that you might do if you're wanting to do a longer scene is maybe look for a natural break in the scene, and then have something else happen in between, and then come back to that scene. So it's all part of one chapter or one story, but you want to be able to break it up and pace it so that it feels like your readers want to continue reading that scene without being overwhelmed, if that makes any sense. And stop me if you've got any questions, because I'll ramble off if no one pauses. So next one, characters. Fighting styles are like fingerprints. All right, so if you're writing a fight sequence, if that's something that you're going into, how a character moves is like a fingerprint for them. The way they stand, the way that they posture themselves, what weapons that they use, if they use any. Batman is a great example of this, because depending on which version of Batman you're going to get one version that's a little bit more acrobatic than others. You're going to get one that goes for just brawling, getting all close in quarters. You've got other versions, for example, like the Michael Keaton version from 1989. He actually didn't do a lot of hand-to-hand fisticuffs like other versions of Batman, and part of the reason why is because Michael Keaton and his stunt double couldn't really move very well in the suit because of how it was made and how it was built. So they staged the fight sequences around how he could move. Whereas you get to later films like The Dark Knight or Batman vs Superman, where they've come a long way in the technology of how they change the suit and build it. There's a lot more flexibility, a lot more movement. Christian Bale's the first Batman to say, "Hey, look, I want to be able to move my neck," because because he wasn't able to do that for 20 years. Just how the characters move is very, very specific. Ava, you mentioned Avatar: The Last Airbender. All the characters in there, especially the benders, they have their own unique way of movement, whether they're a water bender or a fire bender or an earth bender.
It depends on the bending style, because then it could be like water bending, there's more of like a water-like movement.
Right.
Water bending is all about that quick movement and turning a lot.
Right. And
from watching a few parts of some videos that talk about The Legend of Korra and Avatar: The Last Airbender, the different fighting styles, earthbending, they usually just pause for a while.
Yeah.
It's mostly more slow paced and sturdy. But then for firebending, it's all
really
attack.
quick movements.
It's
Yeah.
just all attack, barely any defense except for a few movements, unlike earthbending where they have
It's mostly defense.
where it's mostly defense and a bit attack. So some styles are like completely opposite, and some like airbending and waterbending are kind of similar.
Yeah, and
When
so
they do their bending style.
yeah, and so you get these different styles in the way that the characters move, and that influences and that informs how they move the rest of the time. Like Aang, like because he's an airbender, because the style that he uses, he actually tends to avoid bumping into people. If you notice, the way he moves through a crowd, he just kind of worms his way around things, whereas you'll notice that when a character like Sokka or Katara are moving, they actually tend to spin in circles because that's part of the movement of waterbending. That flow of being able to turn and pivot based on how they move through the crowd. Whereas firebenders, they just barrel on through a group of people. So yeah, so fighting styles, how characters move, those are like fingerprints. Now, we want to talk about embracing all the senses. Okay? Whether it's a fight or not, you want to make sure that you invoke all of the senses. Okay? Don't just focus on sight or touch or hearing or taste or smell. You want to focus on things like balance and equilibrium. Okay? I have a scene in my 4th book where a character is running away from something. And he is sliding across the floor. He's pushed by something, and he goes through a portal. And what ends up happening is as the portal opens and he passes through it, where he ends up is in a completely different place, and he ends up falling on his back from a distance of like 1.5 to 2 feet. All right, because the way he moved through the portal in one direction, the portal opened a different way, and he ends up falling. So you have to kind of think in 3 dimensions when you're thinking about how an action is taking place. So balance and equilibrium are another way, because these are senses that we have. If our balance, if our equilibrium, if our inner ear is thrown off, we get dizzy. It throws off how we're able to walk, how we're able to do anything. It can cause disorientation. It can affect how we see things, how we hear things. And there are other senses that we have, like our sense of gravity. Okay, we can obviously feel ourselves being pulled down, but if you're writing something where characters are in outer space and there's microgravity, something to consider is that every direction is up. If you're floating around in like the International Space Station, it doesn't matter which direction you are facing, you're always going to be facing up. There is no down in outer space. The only time you have down is when you're on a planet. All right. So now we're going to get into our tips for writing. All right. And I have something like 6 or 7 big tips for you guys. And these are crucial to pay attention to. So the first one you want to do is you want to research. Researching other action scenes from books and movies will help give you ideas and descriptions for your own scene. I'm a big movie fan, and I'm constantly looking for how I can describe or how I can form a scene with words based on what I'm seeing. I think cinematically, like I imagine how is this scene going to look if it was done as a movie, or how would it look if it was done as a cartoon or a TV series. Okay, and one of the things that I do to kind of help map out what I'm doing, well, I'll get to that in a moment, but I research as much as I can. Okay, the one thing you don't want to do is get bogged down in too much research, because if you do that, then you don't get any writing done. So there's kind of a fine line between researching and over-researching as an excuse to avoid the writing process. Our next tip number 2, consequences. We talked about this earlier. Consequences. What are the consequences of any action set piece that you write? Good, bad, and everything in between. Okay? What consequences do the characters face? What consequences does society face? What consequences does the world in general face from whatever takes place? Jumping back to Michael Bay, the movie Armageddon. It came out in 1998. Fun movie. Science is a little questionable, but the whole movie starts off with asteroids, these size of a Volkswagen Beetle, dropping on Manhattan. And that's just small asteroids, all right? And it's cataclysmic. The city shuts down. People are running for their lives. They go into a full-blown emergency panic mode. Now imagine if that larger asteroid that they actually have to go and fight in space was to actually hit Earth. It would decimate everything. Everything would be dead. Everything would be gone. All right, so something to think about, how that action goes. And if what you want to write is something small scale, cool. Okay, focus on how it impacts the one or two characters. Whether it's good, bad, or, like I said, everything in between. Tip number 3. You see this tip a lot, and I have a little bit of I have this asterisk here. It says show, don't tell. And this is something I heard a lot when I was working on my creative writing degree. I had my instructors, I had fellow classmates that would constantly say, show, don't tell. The problem is when you're writing a story, you need to tell from time to time, okay? It might help to diagram the action scene before writing it down, to map it out, to know the geography of the scene, and to provide as much detail without info dumping, all right? You don't want to put all the details, all the descriptions into one big paragraph because nobody wants to read all that. You want to break it up so that the layout of the geography or of the scene gets shown in these small little doses, okay? One of the things that I do when I'm mapping out my fight sequences, I will actually draw an overhead sketch, like a bird's eye view sketch of where the scene is taking place. And then I will make notes. I'll use different colored ink to identify which character is where they start and where they go. Just to make sure that I'm aware of the geography of how they're moving and where they're going to end up. That way, when I describe it, it comes out as clear and concise as possible. But the other thing is, when I put this asterisk here, you do need to have some level of telling, because you're writing a story. You're not the camera filming a scene for a movie or a TV show. You are a writer, and you're writing a scene, and people need to have that detail. This rule of show don't tell, that's actually a rule for filmmaking. It actually is not a rule for writing. And the reason for that is because a lot of the times you have filmmakers who will point the camera at their characters or at a scene, and they will have some kind of narration that pops up and tells you everything before you get to see the scene unfold. Or you have characters on screen describing everything for you and info dumping without letting the camera do the work for you. All right? One of the best opening scenes for any movie that I've ever seen is, and I talked about this last month when we were doing our discussion on Back to the Future, but the opening scene of, I'm sorry, well, not Back, it is Back to the Future, but we were talking about writing the opening chapter. I'm getting ahead of myself. But the opening scene has Marty McFly walking into Doc Brown's lab, or his workshop, and all you hear is ticking clocks. And it's just scenes of ticking clocks. And our first encounter with Marty is actually his shoes and him setting down his skateboard in his backpack. And then we see him plug his guitar into Doc's speaker system and his amplifier. And right before everything really kicks off, he jams that first chord and blows out the speaker and knocks himself into a bunch of stuff on the other side of the room. No words are spoken. Nothing is said. We don't even know who this character is until the phone rings Michael J. Fox answers it, and you hear Doc say, "Marty, is that you?" And that's it. That's the first introduction that we have to Marty McFly, and it's mostly told visually. All right. So if you can wrap your description of what's happening in the action in that way that it gives you things piece by piece, but not all at once, you'll do a great job with showing and not telling. But you do have to tell from time to time. Tip number 4, add visuals. Don't leave out important details. Your reader should feel like they are right there in the thick of the action. All right? If characters are in the middle of a battle, your readers need to feel like they're right in the middle of that. They need to be able to smell the conflict. If you have characters that are in the process of, say they're competing for, maybe it's a world championship in ice hockey, at the Summer Olympic or Winter Olympics, your reader should feel like they're there. Like they should be, from the descriptions that you give, they should be able to feel the cold from the ice rink. They should be able to smell the sweat in the air of the players as they're moving across the ice. They should be able to hear the scrape of the skates along the ice. All right, all of those details add to the action scene. Tip number 5, character reactions. Action prompts high emotion. Character reactions to the action adds more depth to your scenes. All right, so if a character is getting upset, we need to see what's prompting them to get upset. So, for example, the short story that I submitted about the goblin, the main character, the narrator, he has a family member taken by this goblin. It's his little sister. And at the end of the story, when he's face to face with this goblin, the goblin starts taunting him, starts goading him, trying to get him to overreact. And what ends up happening is he ends up punching that goblin square in the nose. The goblin's reaction to being punched is a physical, emotional reaction. He gets angry and lunges at the main character. So for every action, there is a reaction emotionally. But behind that, there's another emotion the goblin is experiencing. He's experiencing fear, because goblins typically go after small children that they can be scary towards. Adults are too big for them to really handle, at least in the story that I wrote. And so the goblin is actually more afraid of of my main character in the story, because he knows that he can't do anything about it. All right. So character reactions prompt should be in response to the action that's taking place. Number 6, add realistic emotions. All right. I know this feels kind of like a rehash of the last tip, but this is a little bit different. These scenes enhance emotions. Be willing to explore those emotions in the moment, not just after the action takes place. While you're going to be dealing with emotional consequences, physical consequences, mental consequences after the action takes place, you should also be able to have those emotional responses in the action be real. All right. Whether like we see in like sitcoms, for example, when something goofy happens, it's easy for characters to laugh it off. But like, say for example, you have a character who gets stuck in a laundry chute. All right, they were told not to. They climb in. They get stuck anyway. All right, that character's not going to just be joking around and laughing it off. Maybe afterwards, after the embarrassment has worn off, and they're able to joke around with their friends. But in the moment, especially if it's a kid, they're going to be terrified. They're stuck. All right? How are they going to get out? What's going through their heads? How are they responding to other people? Okay, are the parents mad because the kid is now stuck in the laundry chute? And are they like sad because their parents are mad at them? Or how is this going to play out? So think about how how realistic those emotions are going to be in the moment. Number 7, it's okay to get a little unreal. All right? Get a little fantastical, even if you aren't writing fantasy. Action is fast-paced, so play with characters' perceptions of the action as it takes place. All right? This is an opportunity to really exaggerate what is happening from a character's perspective. All right? One of my favorite movies from when I was a kid, it was this movie with Arnold Schwarzenegger called Last Action Hero. And the thing I loved about it is that you have the main character Danny is this kid who grew up watching action movies, and his favorite is this character played by Arnold Schwarzenegger called Jack Slater. And if you haven't seen it, it's fun. It's really worth watching. It's got a great cast. But what's fun about it is that he goes in, he's ripping and roaring and thinking, man, these action scenes are great. And then he gets magically pulled into the movie. And the first experience he has is he's sitting in the back of Jack Slater's car, and there's a stick of dynamite just rolling around in that back seat. And he's freaking out. And Arnold Schwarzenegger, as Slater, picks it up, lights a cigar, and chucks it behind him like it's nobody's business. It's goofy, it's campy, but at the same time, it talks about how silly action movies can be. There's kind of a meta commentary there. So play around with that exaggeration from your character's perspective. All right? Think about like horror movies. In the moment, those action sequences that take place in horror, whether a character's being chased or they're being attacked by whatever is the threat, whether it's a slasher or an alien or a monster of some kind, the characters have a particular exaggerated sense of what is happening in that scene. Maybe it feels far too real, or maybe it's a lot scarier in their head than they're realizing. Think about how they will respond to that. Any questions before we go on to the writing prompt? Okay, so here is your writing prompt. Yes, our prompty. Good timing too. All right, so you're going to write a single paragraph. 5 or more sentences, that's up to you. You're going to be describing a brief action. Be sure to include the following: 1 or more characters. I recommend 2 or 3 at the least, at the most. A specific type of action. Describe the character's motivations, emotions, and choices, and use sensory detail to help describe the scene or the environment. Yes, Ava.
Question, can I use this? Can I use the writing prompt? I had an idea of using like the characters from my fan fiction in the writing prompt, and
Go
I
for
was
it.
just thinking, would I make this into a scene from my fan fiction, or would I just like make this almost like a filler, where it's just a random idea I have that wouldn't actually be a scene?
That's entirely up to you. If you want to play around with the characters that you're writing, go for it. It's open-ended. It's your playground. So I'm gonna give you guys 20 minutes, and then if you guys need a little bit more time, cool.
Is that our screen still open? Still up here?
Yeah, it should be.
Happen to have a stretch paper by any chance?
I don't, but
I think the gold pen.
yeah, there's this pad over here. this is where I'm going to turn off the live stream because we are done.